I would like to welcome Sophie Hackford as our first speaker. Thank
you. Great. Well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to come and address you guys today and kick things off. As you just heard, I am a futurist. It's a bit of an odd job title to have. But what it essentially means is that I travel around the world visiting people who are doing weird and wonderful things in garages and labs and hacker spaces, largely off the beaten track. I used to work in Silicon Valley, but now I like to focus a little more on places like China and Korea and maybe Detroit and Ukraine, and places that aren't necessarily labelled as being the kind of Silicon Valleys of the world. So I think we perhaps overemphasize what's coming out of the places that we know to be innovative, and we're perhaps ignoring a little bit what's going on in the rest of the world. And so from that kind of research, I essentially pull stories and ideas together and hopefully get you guys a bit engaged and excited about what's coming down the track. I also run a data and AI company that I'm spinning out of Oxford University at the moment. So plenty to keep me busy on the sort of forefront of accelerating technologies. And today I'm going to talk about 4 different tech areas that I think are really important and really interesting, and certainly have a big impact on the way that we do everything, including, of course, work. The first thing I'm going to talk about is signals and sensors. The second thing I'm going to talk about is automating human experience, not just human intelligence. The third thing I'm going to talk about are simulations. So I think they're going to be a huge decision-making tool. And I'm going to finish just very briefly touching on how demography, so the aging economy, and technology are quite, in my view, intimately linked. So as promised, I'm going to kick off by talking about signals and sensors. And for the more beady-eyed around you, you will probably notice that I have quite strong feelings about how we may be moving into a surveillance universe as well. So, of course, we've been talking about big data for an awfully long time. I think what's different about sort of data today is that it's not just about having more data, it's the different kinds of data that we can look at that we've never really been able to look at before. Whether that's voice, images, video, collecting that new kind of data is really coming because we're embedding or camouflaging intelligence, machine intelligence in particular, into our environment. It's sort of disappearing into our homes, our office buildings, our modes of transport, and everything else. And AI is moving us beyond just sort of categorizing and understanding the world and into having AI and machine learning in particular making decisions for us, but also making decisions about us. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I mean by that. I'm going to do that through the sort of the one technology area that I think is interesting in this space, although there are many, and that is sensors. So what's interesting about the sensor space to me is that we know that our world is already full of signals. We've known this for a very long time. There are perceptible, of course, and imperceptible ones, natural and man-made ones, things like Wi-Fi, but also our brainwaves. And the idea is, of course, that machine learning can help us unlock some of the answers or the kind of insights that are in those signals that we've never really been able to think about before. Because when you put, for example, an AI chip into a camera, what you essentially mean is you're giving that camera a brain. And that is what we're doing. We're giving cameras brains, and we're creating computers that can see, and understand, and then, as I said, make decisions. And that's a pretty interesting world that we're moving into. That's something we haven't really ever experienced before. So where are all these brains camouflaged? Well, I'm going to start in outer space. I have, for anyone who's heard me speak before, got a minor obsession with low Earth orbit satellites. A very strange thing to be obsessed with. But these are tiny little satellites, as you can see, emerging out of the back of the International Space Station here. They're being sent up in great quantities by private space companies. And they're doing that so we can image the Earth. And imaging the Earth is useful and interesting because we can suddenly ask questions that we could never ask before. For example, how healthy are the soy crops around? For example, this is Descartes Labs here showing us some pretty impressive and rather beautiful, I think, agricultural imagery. What Descartes will also do is help DARPA, which is the US Defense Research Agency, predict when crops are going to fail and therefore where there may be areas of insurgency around the world because obviously food failure and political unrest tend to be relatively related. You've got companies like Tanker in Canada who can, using AI from space, spot where fires are emerging and sending that information immediately to the emergency services without having to wait, of course, for humans to be able to see what's going on. Orbital Insight is a company I watch very closely in this space who can give you real-time oil levels around the world. Again, something we used to do in a very human way has now been almost completely automated from space, which is very interesting. You can ask what that looked like last year, last week. You can ask about it in countries that don't declare their oil numbers. So you can do a lot of things from space that you could never do before. If one was in retail, again, Orbital does a wonderful job of monitoring car parks of retail outlets across the US. I think it monitors something like 250,000 parking lots at the moment and can then extrapolate what consumer confidence is across the country. Again, in real time, what was it yesterday? What might it therefore be tomorrow? If I was Amazon and I was pricing Whole Foods, I would be able to do that essentially from the comfort of my own home using someone else's satellites from space by extrapolating how many people are driving in and out of their car parks. So being able to do things, proxies for economic activity from space is becoming quite interesting. And in fact, one of the clients of Orbital said relatively recently, which I thought was a wonderful quote, it's like having a direct line to the CIA. Which is interesting, but of course that is now becoming democratized, and that is something that I think is a pretty interesting question. You could ask as well how much solar is being deployed across China, or perhaps a more important question, why do they put panda shapes in their solar fields? But anyway, that's for another day. But you can see how this opens up what we can know. We can know a lot more than we could know before, and we could know it, again, as I said, which is the crucial part, almost in real time. And the question then becomes, what do you want to see and what do you want to understand? What do you want to understand about your competitors? What do you want to understand about your citizens, perhaps? What do you understand about your colleagues or your consumers? Because, of course, from space, as I said, you can see an awful lot. And as I mentioned at the beginning, these private space entrepreneurs, these astropreneurs, as they're known, are sending up these satellites and giving us a great visibility of the planet. And because answers are becoming cheap, it's the sort of discipline of asking questions that I think is going to be something we're going to spend a little bit of time doing over the next few years. But where else are these brains? Not just in space, they're also on drones. There's a military drone, of course, but giving us far greater resolution than the satellites can from space. What happens when some of these drones that you can just about see coming out of the back of these US fighter jets, they can swarm, as they have done here. This is one of the world's largest micro drone swarms that was released in California recently. And you can see on this next slide here, the swarm happening. This is as a Department of Defense video. They have now basically a single brain. These drones can swarm together and autonomously view, recognize people, perhaps with machine vision, recognize objects, fly autonomously, and are going to be swarming in a surveillance way, which is kind of interesting. From a consumer perspective, it's also happening too. This is the Hover Passport drone. It's a Chinese tech company, and it has facial recognition on board, which essentially means it can follow its owner around. Skydio in the US, a group of MIT grads, have a very similar platform. Again, you don't have to program it. It knows who you are, and sometimes, and I'll talk about this a bit later on, it can also take pictures of you autonomously as well if it thinks you're doing something interesting. And this might be a good moment actually to talk about facial recognition, because a lot of companies, of course, are investing quite heavily, particularly China, given that that's a sort of spiritual home of surveillance, that they can really start investing very heavily in these technologies. In Shenzhen, if you jaywalk, you are both prosecuted and humiliated on a billboard. Your face is highlighted and that is shown to all your fellow citizens. They call that, Garvey calls this the perpetual lineup, which I think is a beautiful way of thinking about how machine learning algorithms will change sort of facial recognition in the way that we move around cities. And speaking of which, for those of you who didn't see this, it's a BBC journalist who went to a Chinese police station and basically had a bet with them that to see how far he could get away from the police station before he was found using his face with facial recognition cameras. And it took them only 7 minutes to find him. I don't actually remember which Chinese city it was, but essentially, as I said, once you've got that CCTV network, you have some AI chips that can start sorting and searching. They can find people pretty quickly. The police are, in fact, in China being armed with some of these head-mounted cameras as well. And an Israeli company has even gone so far as to say that they can not only identify who you are, but what kind of person you are as well, which is clearly completely ludicrous and absurd. But apparently they are already selling this to governments, but that may well just be their PR, I don't know. Either way, hugely alarming use case for some of these technologies. Less alarming is Kentucky Fried Chicken, who, based on your face, will offer you menu suggestions, which is a very peculiar use of facial recognition technology, but there we go, only in China. The next layer down from that drone level is the autonomous vehicle. Obviously, we think about the autonomous vehicle in terms of how it's going to transport us around town. What we don't think about is the fact that most of the time it will be collecting an enormous amount of data. It's going to have very, very sophisticated cameras on board in order to see where it's going, obviously, and they will be huge generators of data, but also 360 high frame rate, high definition video of every city, every street that they're driving up and down. I'm sure some of this is probably making you worry a little bit about privacy. In the same statement, often that I hear of people saying that they're worried about privacy, they will also tell me that they own an Amazon Echo, and those two things to me are completely incompatible in one sentence. The Echo sales have in fact exceeded all estimates. Amazon won't tell us exactly how many they've sold, but they have said tens of millions. We don't obviously know exactly how much that is, but Facebook's just announced their own smart speakers are going to be coming out in July. They've called them Aloha and Fiona, which is an interesting female name pattern that we're seeing develop here. But what isn't obviously captured outside our homes from drones and satellites and autonomous vehicles, we will be gleefully giving it away in the privacy of our own homes by inviting these devices into our sitting rooms. Google's Clip is a very, very small camera now, which has a waiting list, which would be sad news, I'm sure, for you all when I tell you what it can do. It will autonomously take pictures of your family in your house, ignoring other people that you haven't told it are important when they're doing interesting and fun things. As I said, you'll have to join the waiting list, but the idea being that we will no longer have to bother with the huge overhead of taking a phone out and taking a photograph. The world will, in fact, take photographs of us autonomously. So this intelligence is becoming increasingly embedded into the environment. And this is a really interesting concept. I'm just going to skip this video and go to this one. There's a guy called Fadel Ardib who's at MIT, and he does this incredible thing where he enables signals within buildings to actually see through walls. So as you can see here, it's a very useful use case that you can switch lights on by pointing at them, but you don't also even have to be in the same room to be able to basically move these signals, as I said, through walls. And that's a really important step, I think, that we're taking when we think about the fact that, as I said, this intelligence is being baked into our surroundings. They call it ambient intelligence. And I think this is a really, I think the video is frozen, a really important leap that we're going to take. He's also even developed a pair of goggles that enables you to see through walls because it can see the shape and the breathing patterns and everything else of the person on the other side. So we're basically creating a sort of data supply chain that's all the way from space to even down to inside our bodies, because inevitably we'll have, I'm sure, sensors both strapped to us, but perhaps also inside us as well. So whether we're talking about satellites, autonomous vehicles, drones, or even biological cells, AI is turning every single atom on the planet and probably beyond into sensors and actuators that will monitor and respond to all of our behaviors. And I like to think about this as the concept of a time machine, which I think is a nice handle to think the fact that if you think of a YouTube video, for example, you can scrub backwards if you want to look back, and obviously scrub forwards if you want to scrub forwards. I'm essentially thinking about this as a metaphor of a time machine where you can actually think about the world like that. You could scrub back in time and ask, well, why did that landslide happen? Why did our competitor be able to produce a whole lot more than we were in that quarter, or whatever it might be, because we're able to link all these different types of data together. Other people call this sort of mission control for Earth. Once we can feed all these different data flows into a kind of mission control type thing, we could use that to perhaps, as I said, figure out what to do after a landslide, or, as I said, do some competitor research, or whatever it might be. Clearly there's some limitations on this that I won't go into in great depth, but what happens when the machine truth about you doesn't match your truth, if your data doesn't quite match how you believe you should be represented. And I think some of our services will probably be based, as they are already in China, on our own personal data. And if we're excluded from those, clearly there are some ethical questions that we need to ask. The other question, of course, that we're seeing a lot in Washington, particularly at the moment, is our data is being traded on the open market. One of my friends, Francis Betonte, talks about how the fact that we kind of built the wrong internet. We didn't build it in a way that actually sort of supports our individual rights, but instead, obviously, we've made it on a kind of monetizing audience basis. And there are lots of other limitations, not just on the sort of ethics and sort of humanity of it, but limitations on data quality, of course. That's one of the reasons why I started a company in that space, but also the fact that we're going to need a hell of a lot more compute we're going to need a lot more power to be able to make sense and make this sort of mission control, and probably whole new computing architectures as well, and new chips, and the whole thing. So lots of things still to come, but certainly machine learning, as I said, has given this amazing ability to kind of think of the world like a computer, the world like a time machine where we can ask lots of questions that we could never ask before. So the second thing that I want to talk about today is about the fact that not only are we automating our intelligence, but also I think, and you can agree with me or disagree with me, we're automating the concept of human experience as well, which is sort of slightly strange thought. I'm going to do this through the sort of medium of virtual reality and augmented reality. So already, for those of you who read anything at all on the internet, which I'm imagining is most of you, we know that we already have a kind of artificial reality around us. Algorithms already create media that's almost indistinguishable from reality. We call that fake news. And I think that we're going to see this sort of step from moving from fake news to sort of fake objects or fake worlds, where real and fake, as it were, are starting to blend imperceptibly. This is Leap Motion doing some quite extraordinary stuff at the very beginning. I mean, we're at day one, of course, of a lot of this technology, but moving into a more 3D and augmented world. And for those of you who hadn't already seen the hyper-reality video that Keiichi Matsuda put together, I still think, even a year later, it's very powerful in light of the kind of 3D universe that we may be moving into, that as we have our entire world augmented with information as opposed to having to look at it on a screen. And it's still pretty crude, but I love that sort of artists are experimenting with how we may watch movies, for example, in the future. And I love this idea, to me anyway, that challenging this concept of content. You know, previously we would have sent our friends like an emoji or a video. We maybe even be able to send our friends John Travolta in the future, which would be kind of an interesting challenge to the concept, as I said, of content as we know it today. But to me, one of the most beautiful examples of this is this concept of virtual wearables. And when I say a beautiful example, I mean something that really makes me think about where we're going. I was never a fan of wearables particularly. I find them quite one-dimensional. They don't have much utility. They're not like a mobile phone where you can do lots of things with them, sort of only one, and I felt you had to wear so many of them to actually get any good data out of it. Didn't really seem worth it. But the idea that we will soon be able to wear some sort of headset or other and be able to have a virtual wearable that can do all kinds of different tasks. So any new task that you're about to do, whether it's painting or editing a video, or learning martial arts, whatever it might be, that you have a wearable specifically to that, which is a very, I think, neat use of augmented reality. The idea that we're moving from loading things onto a screen to loading things around us. The world itself is becoming the internet rather than something we look at on a screen. And I think that when we start using platforms like this is Neon AR, who does this wonderful thing, I think, for augmented reality, that lets you find a friend, in a city or a crowd. When you've lost someone, you can't find them, you just want this big arrow to point above their head. Well, here it is. But of course, the phone at the moment is still a bit clunky. Having something like that is great. It's a wonderful app. But at the same time, I think we all sort of feel that there's an inevitability in the fact that we'll be wearing some sort of headset, probably not quite as clunky as this. It's fairly early, of course, like the first mobile phones, a first iteration of some of these things. This is the meta, that I imagine that we'll be spending a lot more time with, because as I said, there is this sort of what my friend Jody Medich calls the deafening interruptions of having to look at a piece of hardware, which I'm not sure she's maybe a little exaggerating, but that to me is a very interesting concept. We're looking at a heads up world rather than a heads down looking at the screen. And this is being most developed in the workplace so far from a tech perspective. Companies like DAQRI, for example, have these smart headsets where you can essentially annotate the world with information, either in your daily life or because you need to beam in an expert for some reason. If this computer failed or whatever else, when I was wearing a headset like that, I could get someone to help me fix it when obviously they could be anywhere else in the world. That's why they call augmented reality and virtual reality shrinking distances to zero. You can beam in anyone you like. I think it's also the ultimate collaboration tool that around the world, and Microsoft is doing this with the HoloLens as well, but around the world you can beam in different people, different colleagues, and have conversations around a sort of central topic or a central question, or of course play alien-based computer games with them. Lex, which is a company set up by Francis Pitonti, the friend I mentioned earlier, also has the idea that, of course, if you're trying to assemble that infuriating IKEA set, then you can, in fact, have the instructions superimposed on the object rather than having to read the instructions on a screen, which I think is a wonderful way to think about the future of furniture assembly. I think a lot of this stuff speaks to me, anyway, as a sort of future internet. We're not going to search the internet by words, as we used to do. We're kind of going to have the web as the whole world in front of us. We're going to find things by images, type with our eyes, type with our voice, type with possibly even, of course, with our thoughts. Facebook, and I'm sure they're probably a little quieter about this particular technology at the moment, but have this project going on in Building 8, their kind of laboratory, which is about a brain-computer interface that they could read our thoughts. As I said, I'm sure that's not top of their PR list at the moment, but they promise, or said they were last year anyway, talking quite actively about the ability to be able to do that. But what about fully virtual worlds? What about this idea that we may be moving into some sort of surreal state, which I think is a beautiful way to describe it? For those of you who have read the book Ready Player One, or indeed seen the Spielberg film, which is out at the moment, it really is, for me anyway, a very good way of thinking about how this future internet could sort of unravel. Ready Player One is a book based in a fictional world, of course, of 2044, where we have screwed up the planet to such a degree that we instead spend all of our time on something called the Oasis. And the Oasis is a beautiful, very high definition planet. It's virtual, and we go to school there, we shop and hang out, and we basically do everything there from the comfort of our lazy boy or whatever we have at home with a mask over our face and a haptic suit. And I'll talk about the haptics in a minute. But the point is that this virtual world becomes the internet. We live inside the internet. We do everything that we do today on the internet, but in this sort of 3D universe. And of course we need a helmet or some sort of headset for that. The Oculus has just brought out this rather beautiful looking headset. But we'll also need some additional kind of technologies to make this sort of stuff happen. And haptics, the idea that we're automating touch and digitizing touch and human experience is a very interesting one, because platforms like haptics, for example, make it like us be able to feel certain things, whether that's tactile or thermal, of course, feeling hot or cold or whatever else, all really important parts of the human experience that I think virtual reality would be very difficult to do without. There's also this, I think, absolutely hilarious idea that we will also have what they call a omnidirectional treadmill in our house that we'll be able to leap about and jump and defy gravity, all by wearing this sort of really funny looking suit. Again, it's day one. Let's try and remember that and give some sympathy, because I'm not sure it's going to look exactly like that, but I love the idea that we can kind of suspend disbelief and disappear into a sort of virtual rabbit hole. But anyway, let's get back to sort of business. I love this concept of shared dreaming, and this is the concept that virtual technologies give us the ability to hang out with other people and other colleagues and whatever else in a virtual environment. And I want to talk a little bit about the kind of experiences that I think we're going to be automating. And the first is training. This is not Walmart, but I'll give a Walmart example first. 140,000 Walmart employees go through the Walmart Virtual Training Academy every year. There they learn a number of skills, like where to place something on a shelf and don't put it in front of an air vent, and moving things around in warehouses and others, and learning that completely virtually. My friend Aaron here, using the Tribe VR platform, learned to DJ completely virtually before he actually started DJing on a physical turntable. And this, he said, was quite an extraordinary experience when you think about it, that you can actually learn a skill completely virtually before you try it in real life. As I mentioned earlier, with martial arts or flying or surgery, there's plenty of things that I can imagine us trying in virtual worlds first before we endeavour to use them in real life. And the second thing that we'll automate, I'm sure, is shopping. Probably not grocery shopping, but this is just a sort of example video from a company that I know quite well in LA called Sci Futures. And what they do is essentially this incredibly high definition scanning of objects so that they're so beautiful in terms of their detail, you can pick them up and turn them around and sort of read the ingredients or the instructions or whatever else on the back. And while this is maybe going to sound a bit strange, I also think we're going to start buying more digital goods. So if you think about that virtual wearable that I talked about earlier, that was once a piece of hardware. Previously we would have bought a physical wearable. Perhaps in this sort of virtual universe, some of the objects that we previously would have bought in real life are going to become digital. And this is a really interesting concept to kind of think about, that are there things still left for us to digitize or dematerialize? We used to carry maps and torches and all that kind of stuff. I think there is still some things to go for us to dematerialize or melt into pixels, or in fact become software that we at the moment still use as hardware. The final thing I want to talk about in terms of VR automating human experience is the social experience. So up until now, virtual reality has been a relatively sort of solo activity, and Facebook is really trying to get us to think about how we may spend more time in virtual environments with our friends. A sort of 3D Instagram, as it were, where you might share experiences rather than just share ideas or jokes or content. Even the ability, and this is so meta, I don't know what to do with it, that you can take a virtual selfie with your virtual friend in virtual reality, which is something it's too much for me. I can't figure it out. So all this stuff for me anyway is not actually that far away. We can digitally transport ourselves already, as I have demonstrated. We can send experiences around the world rather than just content. I think the internet is going to become more and more 3D, and I think objects, as I said just now, are going to become, some of them anyway, become pixels rather than just hardware. And I think that's going to impact every single element of our life. But I do really think the first real world examples of that will be in the workplace, as I demonstrated earlier. So the third thing I wanted to talk about was simulations. This is very intimately connected to virtual reality. And this is the concept that we're going to be turbocharging decision-making by using virtual worlds and virtual reality to actually test scenarios in silico, as it were, before we try them in real life. And I think that's a really interesting concept that I'd like to just explore a little bit with you guys. So imagine you had a question, for example, like what would happen if we actually had autonomous vehicles in London? It's a very difficult question to answer unless you have software like that of Ascent from Japan. And what they do is help try and simulate what kind of impact that might have on a city. Because of course, it isn't just about the roads. Cities are more than just cars. They are also people and birds and sewage and buildings and weather and all kinds of other things that are very, very difficult to model using normal sort of big data scenarios or big data strategies. But big virtual worlds, particularly computer games, are actually really good as ways to test possible outcomes, particularly the second or third or fourth order consequences of a strategy or an idea that you might have. And I think they're really interesting to think about. How would we imagine how we'd regulate a technology, for example? You could imagine playing with it in a kind of virtual sandpit first and see how the impact that will have on people before you actually try it in real life. So I'll give you examples of how that might play out. So this is a company called Improbable. It's a London-based technology company that does very big simulations and gaming engine. And on the left, you can see that one of the projects they did was simulating the internet. It's actually a very important thing to do, because we have a very precarious internet, which is a very sort of worrying thing if you think about it, given that so much of our lives now is dependent on connectivity. So they mapped all the major nodes from all the major ISPs and computing companies and demonstrated the connectivity, and as I said, the second, maybe and third order consequences of what a vulnerability or a challenge to parts of that internet might be. And it makes me think back to that story, I don't know if any of you guys saw it, in the early, I guess, 2010s, maybe 2011, where a Georgian lady in her well into old age was digging in her garden and inadvertently, while doing that, dug through a cable that cut off the whole of Armenia from the internet. And she said this was desperately unfair that she had all this press coverage because she didn't even know what the internet was. But the idea that it's actually possible to cut a whole country off from the internet by one cable, and I'm sure they've put perhaps a couple of others down since then, is to really highlight those vulnerabilities that we could actually do, as I said, virtually without having to wait until someone's doing their gardening. Political shocks is also an interesting way that we could use these complex virtual worlds to predict. Some really interesting guys at the World Building Media Lab at UCLA predicted or put into one of these simulations what might happen if a city like Lagos ran out of water in 2035. So how can you actually help politicians and others, of course, make better decisions using these virtual platforms? But where it really gets exciting for me is when you think about getting real humans in these simulations rather than just digital ones. Herman Nurula, the guy who founded that company Improbable I mentioned earlier, who modeled the internet, says a very interesting quote. He said 100 million people, when 100 million people enter simultaneously into a virtual world or a big computer game, it ceases to become a game and it becomes a country. And my question is, well, what would you do with that country when you have 100 million people or whatever in a virtual environment playing their games and farming their whatever it is they do in the computer games? How could you use that environment in a kind of strategic way? If you remember Second Life, people actually often used to test their products. They did virtual R&D in Second Life before they actually brought those products out in the real world. They wanted to see how virtual humans interacted with the virtual products. Very cheap, of course, to throw a few pixels together and see if anyone likes it before you go and make that thing in the real world. And so I wonder with some of these massive multiplayer games, like Seed, for example, could be used to test products, services, strategies, and even in the case of Seed here, new democratic platforms. A professor called Lawrence Lessig at Harvard is actually working with the people who made this game, Seed, to try and build new political frameworks to see if we can test new forms of democracy virtually first before we try and do anything radical in real life. So simulation today is really where apparently data science was in the 70s, so it's very much the cutting edge of computer science. But I think it's a really interesting big frontier in computing that we should watch because it'll help us, as I said, try and make some really perhaps better informed decisions about where we're going. So I'm going to finish by talking about the interplay between technology and us, technology and humans. Because, of course, technology today is not in a vacuum. It doesn't just exist in virtual worlds or wherever else. It is, of course, a really crucial part of our everyday life. And it's framed by some really big macro drivers that I think the technology world often neglects to think about. And those macro drivers are things like climate change, things like demography, which I'm going to talk about today, economics, migration. It's very important that we understand how humans and how technology work together. Because in a lot of countries, there is a very stark demographic reality. They have, I don't think that's mine, they have some very, very scary, I'm on flight safe mode. No, can't tell whether it's, anyway, maybe it is me.
They're monitoring you.
They are, aren't they? I know. I wonder who it is.
Fake brother.
Anyway, a lot of countries have a very stark demographic situation. A lot of countries are getting very old very quickly, particularly China, Japan, Korea, but all of us are inevitably, eventually across this century, heading in the same direction. And I think it's a very important driver of technological change that we're really not talking, I don't think, enough about. So just go through some big numbers and then I'll talk to you about how I think that impacts technology. So last century, 25% of the world's population and 25% of the world's workers were European. Some projections have us that by the end of this century, by 2100, only 3% of the world will be European. And there will clearly be a massive balance of power shift when we start seeing some of these numbers play out. Because global fertility has completely halved in the last 50 years, according to Max Rosa at Oxford. And that's why a lot of people are thinking about this in terms of the kind of age that we're going into. When you look at countries like Japan, for example, as a kind of a bellwether for all of us, they, in 2015, were the first country to have more funerals than weddings and sell more adult nappies than baby nappies. In China, they are going down the similar path at the moment. Their fertility rate in some parts of the country is down to 0.75. You need 2.1 in order to be at replacement rate, as in to keep the same population level. People in over 60 in China are more numerous than the whole population of Russia. And there are plenty of other, I mean, endlessly list these kind of statistics of various countries around the world. When I spent some time recently, not willingly, I can assure you, in Chinese Disneyland, what you're able to see there is that you get the phenomenon of 6 pockets. That actually Chinese Disneyland is a very adult experience because you have one child, 2 sets, 1 set of parents and 4 sets of grandparents. So most people, as I observed in Chinese Disneyland, have grey hair. And it's also very quiet as a result. Everyone's very well behaved because actually only a fifth of people there are under the age of 18 or whatever. So as I said, this really drives our relationship with technology in a really interesting way that I just want to kind of finish up on because I think it's really interesting. And it isn't just about elder care. I think there's an obvious use for robotics in places at the other end of the age spectrum, as we heard from Tanya earlier, who need support and perhaps will have more robotics there to help out. But actually, it isn't just about the elder end of the demographic spectrum, particularly in countries like China, Japan, and Korea. They've been spending very heavily on robotics over the last few years because they're actually going to run out of key workers, maybe plumbers, teachers, nurses, whatever. Those people aren't being born. And that is driving, in turn, a huge investment in robotics. The Russian army is another example of this, where they're actually been, again, investing heavily in autonomy because there simply won't be enough young Russian men to enter the army to sustain the numbers that they've had in the past. So bad demographics have actually been, as I said, hugely creating an investment in robots in ways that we haven't really seen before. And that's why we're beginning to see a lot more, like the Sophie robot, for example, from Rethink, who is realistic in a way, and we'll be spending a lot more time as that kind of cobot. The idea that man and machine will be working together, I think, is almost inevitable. These ones you see, just a quick snapshot I took of a store in Shenzhen in China, where you interact a great deal more with robotics than you do certainly over here. And we'll probably be wearing them as well. This is the Superflex suit. Again, imagine the first generation of the mobile phone will probably get lighter and lighter in the same way these suits are going to get lighter and lighter. They have AI in them, which means they can help you upstairs, they can help you lift things and protect the body. And Bionic, in fact, have also not just got the AI on board, but Amazon's Alexa is also being integrated, so you can operate it with your voice. And not just, as I said, at the elder end of the spectrum, but the rather amusingly called chairless chair enables you to just sit down if you feel like it. All these things, I'm sure, across the age spectrum will be merging, as I said, this sort of man and machine concept, to the degree as well that we will see robots not just made of very sharp and heavy hardware, but also, as Other Lab demonstrates here, soft robots made of fabric that you can just fold up in your sock drawer when you finish using them, and then you can use them to lift other humans or whatever it is that you wanted to do. And I think we're going to see a convergence of this, as this Wired article described, where we see at various ends of the age spectrum people doing things they didn't really expect to be doing because we're going to be living a whole lot longer. And Amazon has something called Camper Force, which is a group of a lot of very older American citizens who onboard their what are those big sort of caravans that the Americans have?
RVs.
Yes, RVs, exactly. And they drive around the country to various places, particularly that have warmer climates in the winter, and work for Amazon for 2-3 months at a go. Some of them are housing refugees because a lot of the time they're a bit poor towards their older age because, again, we're not really planning for a longevity, the kind of longevity that we're probably going to see in the next few years. So some really interesting, I think, collisions between technology and demography that I think we really need to start thinking about very carefully, particularly in the workplace. So to finish, the one thing that I would say about scientists and technologists is that if you tell them to build things, they will. And we're seeing a lot of that at the moment, and I said particularly in Washington, that if we don't ask questions, we will be, as Cory Doctorow says, Huxleyed into the full Orwell, which I think is a beautiful way to describe where we could end up if we're not careful. So for me, it's very much about asking important questions about the future and where we're going now, as opposed to as a perhaps sleepwalking into a more undesirable future, because we have very, very powerful technologies now available at our fingertips that are really changing what it really almost means to be human. As I said, we've automated certain human experiences now using virtual reality. So I want us to take those powerful technologies and build the world we want, rather than sleepwalk into something undesirable. Thank you very much.